All right. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So today we're continuing our consideration of Nyoho food. So in this 4-month section, again, we're thinking about food as it relates to the teachings of Nyoho. This morning, some of us got here mighty early and did a little early zazen and did a formal breakfast. So about 8 of us got together and did that. And I think the helpful thing about that for us, restarting that practice now, we used to do it every week. And then people became unavailable and you need a sort of a critical mass, right, to do that practice. So I think the valuable thing for us is for those of us that are familiar with that practice, keeps it in our body, right, keeps our skills up. This is something we do during sesshin. We do these formal meals, but we do them completely silently because, of course, there is absolutely no talking during sesshin. So this, when we do it outside of sesshin, is our opportunity to do it with all the chanting, which gives us some context, right? We kind of know why we're doing what we're doing because we're doing that. So for those of us that are familiar with that, it keeps the skills up. And for those that have never done it before or need a bit of a refresher, it's a good opportunity, a low stress opportunity to watch and learn and follow along. So several things are coming together now during this 4-month section where we can really start to think about all the aspects of Nyoho food. I think there are 5 areas, 5 things that we can think about during this 4-month section. We can think about ingredients. We can think about cooking, serving, eating, and cleaning up. All of those things are related to Nyoho food. So we have a lot of ground we can cover. And later in June, we're going to hear about ingredients from Sawyer, who's, of course, our subject matter expert a bit, right? Deeply involved with with that aspect of food practice here at Sanshin. So we have, I think, in these 4 months, a real well-rounded opportunity to think about food in all of its glory, right? In all of its aspects. So today, I will start with the practice of cooking. So we'll go forth and back a little bit. We'll back up later on and hear about ingredients, but I want to start today with the practice of cooking. How do we think about food and plan for that activity and actually engage in preparing that meal? So I need to cover a lot of ground because I've only got 3 talks to give in this 4-month section because, of course, August is Quiet August and we don't do any talks. So fortunately, we already have several resources available for this as well as opportunities for hands-on practice. Of course, I can recommend Uchiyama Roshi's commentary on the Tenzo Kyokun, which has been printed under various names like How to Cook Your Life and From the Kitchen to Enlightenment. So that, of course, is a great resource. Of course, that whole thing is just a metaphor for managing our lives. Tenzo Kyokun is about cooking, but it's about managing our lives. And Uchiyama Roshi's book is very much about managing our lives. He talks about the cooking, but he's talking about a lot of other things, very familiar themes in that book. So again, we can see how food, clothing, and shelter are all instances of this thing I'm calling tangible thusness, right? So there are some abstract teachings about this, but also there are very concrete, everyday, tangible ways that these things are dharma gates, and we can engage with them in that way. So if we're used to cooking at home in our day-to-day lives, we might be sort of relieved here when we are asked to help in the kitchen and engage in kitchen practice. Maybe that is something which is familiar in a Zen world of stuff that feels exotic or new or a little bit scary, right? I don't know anything about ceremonies or dogen or precepts, but I know how to make soup. So that can feel like, yes, I know what that is. I can do that. Sorry to say, in the world of Zen cooking, your number 1 job is not making the soup. Your number 1 job is to be awake and functioning in real reality. So just like all the other activities of our lives, and we could say the same thing about sewing, and we can say the same thing about managing the temple, keeping the temple, our number 1 job is simply to be awake and functioning in this moment of real reality. Cooking is there, yes, but. So it's the same dynamic we encounter when someone's already familiar with sewing and decides they're going to take precepts and make a rakusu, and we might think, well, this should be an easy, fun project. I do sewing all the time at home. I know how to thread a needle. In my day-to-day life, this is familiar to me, so, no worries. And then, of course, we pick up the needle and we work with Esho and Yuko, and we realize very quickly this is a whole new world of sewing. Not just the skills, but the attitude, right? I mean, and I'm speaking from experience, because I was one of those when I sewed my first rocks. I thought, piece of cake, and then you realize this is not your standard sewing project. There's something much more happening here. So it's the same with our cooking practice. Your job as a cook, let go of all the fabrications, all the preconceived ideas, not be separate from the functioning that's going on right here and now. This isn't the same as the ordinary process of simply cranking out 3 meals a day in order to eat, right, or feed the family or something like that. This is the activity of a Buddha. So we need to have the eyes and the attitude and the wisdom and the compassion of a Buddha when we're in the kitchen simply making a peanut butter sandwich, which feels a little strange. So cooking practice, nothing more or less than zazen, manifesting in our daily lives. So Uchiyama Roshi says, if we see this job of cooking in the ordinary sense, that is, as being just one occupation in society, then the tenzo becomes nothing more than an ordinary cook. If in a broader context, if being born into the world assumes no more importance than to appear on stage as another member of society, then the meaning of life stops there. However, the function of the tenzo, expressing the Buddha Dharma in terms of living out the vivid and dynamic quality of his life, lives as the total self, capital S self, in whatever circumstances might arise. As long as this self is identical with its world, when we function in the role of the tenzo, this functioning becomes the life of the self. At the same time, this is the dojo where we practice living the universal self. So he's talking a lot about big self here, right? Yeah, we're chopping the potatoes. And also, there's big self happening here. So one aspect of understanding cooking as something other than ordinary activity in society is to look carefully at what society tells us is valuable, right? We have a lot of influence in deciding what is meaningful, what is useful, wholesome, worthwhile, valuable, right? If we think making a really high-class meal is the point, where does that come from? Is it really better than the peanut butter sandwich, the plain food, the vegetable soup? Are we cooking to feed our egos? Or are we cooking to support practice? And again, I speak from experience because that was a big pitfall for me early on. I realized, looking back, I was really cooking to feed my ego. I was making stuff I should never have been making under those circumstances because I was trying to do the most complicated, most impressive thing I could do. So, in a way, that was very wholehearted and very sincere because I wanted to give the best for the people in the zendo who were eating. And on the other hand, there was a lot of ego in there, right? So are we cooking to feed our egos? Or are we cooking to support the practice of the people that are receiving that food? And we really need to start from the perspective of the people who are receiving the food and kind of work backwards. If we step back, food is food. I remember the day standing in the kitchen in the Minnesota Zen Center looking at a carrot and going, this is just a carrot. Because I'd written a lot of stories about this carrot, man. This was going to be the most impressive carrot anybody had ever eaten. And I went, wait a minute, this is just a carrot. And I knew something had shifted for me in that moment. It was really interesting. So yes, that meal should be nutritious. It should be appealing. It should be prepared carefully. It is an offering to other Buddhas, right? All of that is true. But if we're seeing it with the eyes of Buddha, then adding our judgment to that is not necessary, right? Luxury fruit is not necessarily better than apples. The really fancy stuff, complicated stuff I was making was not better than simple rice and soup and a little steamed veg, I was up until 2 a.m. the night before, chopping and prepping and making sure that all these things were going to happen at the right time. And I thought, this is not the way this is supposed to work. I've missed the mark somewhere, I went into the kitchen with a cookbook and a bottle of aspirin and just was going to tough this out. And it was very much about me overcoming my own stuff, right? So that luxury fruit, not better than plain apples or bananas. That means we cut and we cook those apples just as carefully as if they were exotic or expensive or somehow rare, right? It's the same attitude. We approach making that peanut butter sandwich with the same care that we would if we were making a fancy dinner and if that was the appropriate thing in that moment. This is exactly the Nyoho teaching about asking ourselves whether things are creating attachment. Is this food, is this robe, is this building designed in such a way as to create attachment? And what's interesting about this cooking practice is, where is the attachment? Is it here or is it the recipient? Right? There's all kinds of attachment that can happen there. Is this meal something which we're creating in such a way that it can create some attachment? If recipes are complicated, That's great. Maybe that's appropriate. If they're not complicated, that's also great. That's also appropriate. So one of the challenges of cooking is that we're likely to be doing more than one thing at a time, right? So if we're cooking for a meal using oryoki, we've got at least 3 dishes and sometimes 5. So you're in the kitchen managing, and here we have a very small kitchen, so there's not a crew, it's you. It's you in the kitchen. You're managing a lot happening at one time because there's no, oh, the meal's a little bit late, go have another drink at the bar and we'll come and get you, right? When it's time for the meal during sesshin, the bell rings and it's time for the meal and you don't have any pad, right? There's no pad. So we're doing more than one thing at a time, and what we're doing affects other beings. So there's a fair amount we've got to hold in that space while we're engaging in that practice. That means we really have to be awake in the kitchen, especially if we're dealing with things like sharp knives and hot burners, right? Things that can really be dangerous. We've got to be looking at more than what's just right in front of me, right? Don't put that knife down in such a way that somebody's going to come through the door and pick it up or knock into it, or it's going to fall on somebody's foot, right? Somebody gets injured. Don't stack things in a way that are going to create an avalanche. And again, the voice of experience, right? I am not good at managing space, and I am not always careful about that. So even Dogen says, you know, put things in the right place. Don't set up an avalanche for somebody. Don't lean over a burner with your sleeve trailing over that fire so that you're going to, you know, light something up or melt something, right? All these little things. If we're preoccupied with our fabrications, you got to know disaster is going to strike. You know, there's probably nobody here that hasn't had something happen in a kitchen, right? If we're not paying attention, disaster is going to strike. It's a very direct, immediate situation for understanding paying attention, the importance of paying attention in our lives. Somebody who works in a wood shop, I'm pointing at Hoshin, learns that lesson in other ways, right? You know, don't get your sleeve caught in the wood lathe. That would be a bad thing. So, got to pay attention. Sometimes folks arrive at the Dharma Center with lovely, sincere attitudes, and for a variety of reasons, a minimum of life skills. They're lovely, very sincere, very smart people, but somehow they've not necessarily been in a situation where they've learned a lot of life skills. They have no idea that there's any more to practice than learning to sit zazen and chant sutras and you know, light incense and do ceremonies and all of those things. Often where they really need direction is not in those things. It's in how do we sweep a floor? How do we wash dishes? How do we shovel snow? How do we cook food, right? Somehow, sometimes, folks have been taken care of all their lives in some ways by people who mean well, right? Had things done for them, and it's so easy to want to just stay in that world of our imagination. Well, when I go to the Dharma Center, the work there is, you know, very holy stuff. Even sweeping the gravel can take on an aura, right? I've certainly heard teachers say, man, you know, when people come to the Dharma Center, nobody wants to balance the checkbook or pay the bills because somehow that's not dharmic enough. It's not exotic enough. It's not simple enough. It feels too corporate. And yet what the sangha really needs is somebody to get out the checkbook and pay the bills, right? So somehow it's the everyday stuff, right? That is, those are the Dharma gates we can pass up. Those are the Dharma gates we can miss. So suddenly we're confronted with the reality of life in the temple that, hey, this thing requires real world skills. Here and now stuff, right? If we're going to eat meals, somebody needs to cook the meals. Where are they coming from, right? If we're offering food to Buddhas, whether that's this kind of Buddha or human Buddhas, right? Where are those meals coming from? If we want clean bathrooms, someone has to clean the bathrooms, right? There's no outside, there's no someone out there that magically is going to somehow do that work. The same way as, you know, doing admin, creating a website, doing whatever is not somebody out there. Those things are practice. Those are Dharma gates. So Uchiyama Roshi sees the role of a tenzo as a particularly important intersect between zazen and religion. And he's using religion here to mean an approach to living our everyday lives in the world. He's not using religion as something out there. He's saying tenzo, work as the tenzo, work in the kitchen is a really important gateway, a connection. How do we manifest this zazen in our day-to-day lives in a way which includes our attitude, our functioning, right? It's not something special. It's not a one-off. It's like, what's our direction? So cooking a meal is not spending blissful hours on a mountaintop doing, peaceful zazen and drinking tea. It's not like that. It's hard physical work. Sometimes you're on your feet for a long time. You're schlepping groceries around. You need to engage your brain and all your senses. And it's also a complete expression of awakening. So it's really important that we understand there is no gap, right, between the rest of our practice and activities like cooking, day-to-day activities like cooking. So in the training temple, Doju can tell you, nobody asks you if you feel like cooking or if you have any experience in the kitchen. The jobs rotate. In our case, it was every 5 days. I don't know about you. And when it was your turn, you went into the kitchen. You were the person cooking. You didn't get a choice about that. Everyone rotates. When you're in the kitchen, you need to feed everybody, whether you like it or not, whether you think you know what you're doing or not. You go into the kitchen and you take it up. So when I was training, we had an Australian novice who was assigned as the tenzo, and she went into the kitchen. And she turned on her heel and came right back out again and said, I'm not going to do this because there's nothing in the kitchen to cook with. Right? She couldn't make anything out of the few ingredients we had. So you may know at that time our training temple was about the poorest. If you looked at the lineup, somebody did, our training temple was about the poorest one in the system. It had only been open again for about 18 months. It had been abandoned for 20 years before that. So, we didn't have systems for people making a lot of donations or collecting a lot of financial support. What we bought for food was typically the thing that was on sale, the thing we could get the cheapest, the thing that was probably the plainest thing. When you went into the kitchen to decide what you were going to cook, probably it was the thing that was going to spoil first, because we couldn't afford to waste food, right? So things were pretty on the ground. We were living in a pretty subsistence way. So in she goes. She looks around. She comes back out and says, I can't do anything with that. There's nothing in there. I can't make a meal. And I thought, well, if you're the tenzo, if that's your assignment and you've gone in there and you come back out and said, I can't make a meal, are we all going to go hungry? I mean, what? What are we going to do? We've got a temple full of people. So what do we do about that? So refusing to cook a meal wasn't really an option. For her, she was like so paralyzed by that. She was completely lost. She's, a smart lady, but she looked at that and just kind of stopped in her tracks, right? She was kind of paralyzed by that. So I went into the kitchen. I thought, I'm going to try to help. I went into the kitchen. I looked around. I found potatoes, onions, and cabbage. And I thought, okay. I made rice, and I made potato soup, and I made coleslaw, and it was very plain and perfectly edible. And I thought, okay, you do what you have to do, right, with what you've got. So rather than having some idea about the cooking or about the meal, we go into the kitchen, we look around, we see what's there, and then we wholeheartedly engage with whatever that is. Just like when we're sitting, we wholeheartedly engage with that activity, right? That doesn't mean we're oblivious to the larger effect that we're having on people. This kind of concentration and effort and wholeheartedness is not sort of with blinders on, with blinkers on. So in fact, if we're not including in our awareness this larger effect on other people, we're not really paying attention to the whole picture. We're seeing only this much. So paying attention doesn't mean I block everything else out in order to only do this. Paying attention means I have a broad perspective. I have some idea what's going on around me as well. So in our little Zendo kitchen here, of course, we have to be incredibly careful about noise. I mean, we're literally right there. There is one wall between the kitchen and the people sitting here. That wall is anything but soundproof, including the door, including the sound comes through the ceiling, right? Just on the other side of where the tenzo is cooking, people are sitting zazen, right there, lined up sitting zazen. So noise comes through everywhere. We hear everything. I'm on the farthest possible side of the Zendo, and sometimes I can hear things happening, right? So we hear knives on cutting boards. We hear running water, we hear oven door banging, we hear pots clanging in the sink. Sometimes we can hear dry goods being poured into measuring cups, right? That's simply the tenzo doing the tenzo's job. Tenzo's not doing anything wrong. We're saying, please feed us, and that those are the mechanics, right, of what that's going to take. And it's a really great practice to try to have to be silent in there while we're cooking. You can't not pay attention to what you're doing. One of the things I've learned about being quiet, you can't not pay attention to what you're doing and be silent. And that means that kind of attitude covers kitchen work. It covers in the morning the jikido, getting up and lighting the candle and the charcoal and getting ready for the service. It covers me when I'm doing the morning rounds. How quietly can I walk behind everybody without the kimono flapping and the feet hitting the floor, right? It's a little game I play with myself, by the way. I try to sneak up on people. They can see me coming out of their peripheral vision, but it's like I try to sneak up. How quietly can I walk on this floor? That practice of being silent, as quiet as we can be, is really helpful. And it's helpful not only for the concentration of the people around us, it's helpful for our own attention span, helpful for our own concentration. So we've got to think ahead. If we're going to do things quietly, we can't just march into the kitchen kind of waving our arms, throwing things around, doing whatever we want. Oh, we need to put a cloth under that cutting board so it doesn't reverberate on the counter. You know? Oh, I need to have thought ahead of time about when. Like maybe people are doing kinhin. Now is the time to do that noisy job. At least people are up and walking around. So Cedar Rapids Zen Center also has a kitchen right across from the Zendo, very close to the Zendo. The only thing between it is a curtain or two. We at least have a wall and a sliding door. All they have literally is a couple of curtains between. So once, many years ago, I was in there cooking during sesshin. I'd been assigned. It was my turn. So I went in and followed the plan and made the food. And somehow, whatever I was making, I ended up scraping something out of a metal bowl with a metal spoon. So you can imagine the noise. I'm sure I was putting something into a serving dish or something. And I thought, well, this is less than ideal. Pretty soon, next kinhin period, here comes Zuiko. She walks into the kitchen. She picks up a spatula and hands it to me. And I went, oh! It was right there, right? And somehow, I had missed that whole opportunity. I didn't need to be scraping that metal thing with a metal spoon. I should have seen what to do. On my own, I should have noticed that noise and recognized it was going to reverberate all the way into the Zendo. She actually had to come in and go, here. I went, oh, right? A missed opportunity for attention. So as bodhisattvas, of course, we vow to liberate all beings. That includes the non-sentient beings that we work with in the kitchen. So we need to liberate those non-sentient beings, namely the tools and pots and pans and food, from our own self-centeredness. So interesting, right? We've talked here before about liberating things. How do we liberate things? Not just sentient beings like our sangha members. And what are we liberating those things from? We're liberating them from our own stuckness, from our own ideas and fabrications and expectations, right? How can we liberate those things? We need to see when we're not treating tools, pots, pans, ingredients carefully. One way they're telling us you're not treating me carefully is to make noise. So when I'm scraping a metal bowl with a metal spoon and it's screaming at me, how am I not hearing that? How am I not hearing it saying, you're not taking good care of me? You're not taking good care of this situation. So Uchiyama Roshi says, when you work with some tool or utensil, you should put it back when you're finished with it and not just leave it sitting around. When you put a pot down roughly, banging it around on concrete or a tiled sink, it cries out in pain. If you are still unable to hear that cry, then you can hardly be said to be a person living out zazen in your daily life, right? So we might not think these things are preaching the dharma, and they are preaching sometimes with sound. Are we listening? I clearly wasn't. That's our opportunity, right? To find another dharma gate, go through another dharma gate. So it's pretty easy to forget all that. How much noise am I making? Am I banging things around? Am I paying attention to pots, spoons, ingredients? When the clock is ticking, we know that bell's going to ring. Jikido's in here watching the clock. As I say, there's not a chance to say, go wander around a little bit and come back when the meal is ready. When the bell rings, you need, food ready in your server's hands, ready to go out to the Zendo. So oh, well, there's no time to be careful. I just have to get this done because, gosh, things are running behind, right? And suddenly all our good intentions go right out the window, and we stop listening and we stop paying attention because we get really fixed on an outcome. And the outcome is there's food in pots ready to go at a certain kind of time. So we become self-involved. Then it becomes all about this one. Am I going to beat the clock? Who cares about the effect on other people? Am I going to meet the expectation? You know, am I going to be somebody that impresses people, or am I going to be somebody that people are annoyed with? And now it's all about me. So our consideration as cooks is not just for the beings we're feeding, but for the beings with whom we're partnering when we're working in the kitchen to get that meal made. So again, what a broad perspective. It seems very simple. I'm cooking a meal. And now I'm dealing with this being, and I'm dealing with pots, pans, spoon beings, and I'm dealing with the recipients of the food beings, and I'm dealing with all beings. So we don't need to get precious about it. We can sort of imbue that with a lot of magic and a lot of aw shucks. And, you know, that's just another set of ideas. We need to not kind of make that a magical thing. The carrot is simply a carrot. And yet, right, we just need to pay attention and we need to listen. So Todo-san has said, the tenzo as a person and the fire and the other things working together is samadhi. It's not a matter of the tenzo using things, but the tenzo and those things working together seamlessly. That samadhi is possible by seeing impermanence and egolessness, right? Can you imagine the heat, the steam, the rush, the clang of the kitchen? That's samadhi. That's beings working together, and that is an instance of samadhi. So even when you're by yourself in the kitchen, as we so often are here, there's really a team of beings all functioning in there. Can we see that activity in that way? There's interconnectedness across space, but there's also interconnectedness across time. So Dogen says when we're cooking for others in the temple, we need to make a plan the night before so we know what we're going to make and we know how much we're going to need, and everyone's on the same page. And that might seem strange because we're always hearing that the only place we can actually do something, the only place we can take action, is here and now. Because, of course, the past is gone, the future's not yet here, this is all we have. And here's Dogen saying, but wait a minute. You need to think ahead. You need to make a plan if you're feeding people in a temple. And if you're feeding your family. So, not only that, we're also always hearing we can't act in the future. Right? We've just said future's not here. We can't act in the future. So we shouldn't get too caught up in clinging to outcomes, right? We don't know what the future is going to bring. We can't live in that future, so we shouldn't get too caught up in outcomes. So sometimes folks hear those teachings and they ask, does that mean we should just be floating along in our lives with no direction? Sort of no objectives, just whatever comes along is what comes along, and we need to just sort of give up any idea that we're going to have any control or have any aspiration. And the answer, of course, is clearly no. That is not what our teachers are telling us. They're not telling us to live that way. You might be making a plan for the future, but the activity of planning is happening right now. This is the only place we can take action in this now, and so now is the activity of planning. And somewhere down the road, the activity might be executing the plan, right? But you're planning right now, which means we're taking the same care with the planning that we're taking with any other kind of activity. So even though we can't control the outcome, the responsible thing to do, because what we're doing is affecting other beings, is to prepare as best we can and to act as wholesomely as we can and put that activity out there and then open the hand, right? Then let go, because we can't control what happens after that, how that's accepted, how that unfolds. So the activity of making a meal plan for the next day is the work of tonight, right? Because of impermanence, anything can happen between tonight and tomorrow morning when it's time to actually make the breakfast or make the meal. We can't become attached to that goal. Now we're back to attachment. Yoho is about watching attachment, right? So we can't be attached to the goal, but we do need to have a direction. Otherwise, we can't carry out the bodhisattva work. We can't be prepared for things. We can't have the ingredients we need. We don't know how many people are coming, right? We need to make a plan. So any place attachment comes up is an opportunity to think about Yoho, right? If, again, the central question of Yoho is this something which is creating attachment? Is the food creating attachment? Is the plan creating attachment? What about this circumstance is a place that we can get stuck, a place we can grab onto something and go, it's this thing, right? How do we watch for that stuff? We can ask ourselves not only about the food, but about the activities. Do the activities themselves create attachment? Do I have an ego attachment to the way this is going? The way I'm doing this or the way it's being received? If so, where are we stuck? How can we get back to an attitude of letting go of that attachment and not abrogate our responsibility? It's a really interesting intersection, right? How do we have good intention? How do we do something completely, wholeheartedly, wholesomely, and also open the hand? It's a really interesting place to practice. And tenzo work, cooking work, is such a dharma gate for that. Meals happen very quickly. It might take half an hour or half a day to cook a meal, but I mean, you're in there, you're doing the work, you're putting it out for people, the people are receiving it, and you turn right around and probably make the next meal. So unlike some activities where that's a process of years, this is a process of hours or minutes. We get that feedback really quickly. It's like you get to watch that happening for you 3 times a day, right? So in the simple act of getting ready for breakfast, we have this dharma gate about cause and effect, and about impermanence, and about interconnectedness. There's just so much happening in there. The practice of cooking sits right in the middle of all those intersections. So this very simple, day-to-day, very real, very tangible activity sits in the middle of these huge intersections. There's so much we can investigate there. So we have to recognize interconnectedness across both space and time. So we can't be absent-minded in the kitchen. We can't be focusing on somewhere else other than here and now, because what disaster will happen? If we're not paying attention, something is going to go awry. Something's going to go off the rails. We also, so that's we can't be focused out here and not paying attention to this. We also can't be so single-minded that we're oblivious to what's going on around us and the effect that we're having on others. So, traditionally, the tenzo is one of the highest ranking officers in the temple. And that seems a little strange because cooking seems like sort of a menial activity. Well, we'll just get somebody to, boil up some rice. The real high-level jobs have got to be all about teaching the dharma, right? And leading ceremonies and wearing robes and doing all that stuff, right? Well, guess what? The tenzo is actually one of the highest-ranking officers because you need real practice maturity to be managing all the aspects of that operation, right? You're taking care of the resources of the temple. And again, those things were all donated. So you can't just sort of blow that off, right? You've got to take care of those resources, which came from the donors. You're responsible for making sure that practitioners have what they need. So, to keep them physically comfortable and alive so they can practice. I mean, that's a huge responsibility. You're responsible for probably managing other workers if you're in a larger place than ours. You probably have a kitchen crew. You're managing them with all the complexity, right, that goes with leading human beings to do anything, right? But, to have an objective like creating a meal. That's not even to mention the actual cooking skills. Do you have knife skills? Can you read a recipe, right? Can you actually make food? This is a complicated practice. So Dogen shows us clearly, cooking is not a menial chore that we just sort of toss off, right? Give to whoever's available. It's not something we do on the way to something better. We're cooking this meal on the way to doing a big ceremony, or I'm cooking this meal because it's my turn, but tomorrow I'm going to get to ring a bell, right? It's not something we do on the way to something else. It is the thing of this moment, right? So, of course, he's talking about cooking, and he's really talking about all the aspects of our daily lives, all the chores, all the jobs, all the tasks, all the work of our everyday lives. If we try to understand Nyoho food, we can understand a lot about the rest of our lives. And boy, we understand a lot about this. So just like you're sewing a rock or you're sewing a robe, and you just keep seeing where you want to get stuck and where you want to go off the rails, boy, cooking will do the same job for you, and you get to do it 3 times a day, every day. So we can follow a recipe. We can follow a set of instructions. We can follow a strategic plan. Maybe it's cooking. Maybe we're building something. Maybe we're working with an organization. That's all good. We have all those directions, guidelines, plans. And then what happens when the universe shows up and something changes, because we know it will, right? cause and effect and impermanence and interconnectedness. Something changes and we have to pivot. Now what? Okay, well, if you've ever had disaster in the kitchen and you've had to pivot, you understand why that is a job for somebody with some chops. So more than once in my tenzo life, I've had to go to plan B in the midst of something, cooking a meal, or running a kitchen during sesshin, right? Once I was cooking for a 7-day sesshin with at least a couple of dozen participants. I don't remember how many. This was some years back. I had half the week's groceries in my car, and the other half of the groceries were in somebody else's car, and that person had car trouble and didn't arrive. So I've got 24 people to feed for a week. I have 50% of the food I thought I would have. And of course, we didn't put that in the cars according to, now this is the first 3 days' food, and this is the last 3 days' food. This is whatever fit. All went in the cars. So I had to rearrange meals on the fly using whatever I had, and still try to have balance in the meal. So you may know, because we've talked about this here, right? We need to balance for color and cooking method and flavor and all that stuff. So I had to look what I had and still balance, and hope that we were going hope that by the end, second half of the week we were going to figure something out, right? Big plan B. I remember looking once in the refrigerator and realizing that the refrigerator was so cold it had frozen the cucumbers. I'm sure it was going to make a cucumber salad, and you look at that and go, right? What do? This is what happens, and this is life, you know? We can't be so attached to the plan we make that we're unable to look around and pivot. We've got to be able to see broadly. So we need to make plans in order to be responsible, but we also have to be engaged in the kitchen. We can't be on autopilot. We can't pull out the next menu and just sort of blindly follow. You know, what if that's not what's going on? Or what if a donor shows up with food that needs to get eaten, like soon? Suddenly you need to make a plan. You need to shift your plan. So even if things are going well, we still have to manage that food with wisdom and compassion. So if things are going awry, wisdom and compassion. And even if things are going the way we expect, we can't sort of switch off the brain, right? We still have to be engaged with that. Things have to be cooked properly. They have to be presented in an appealing way. Nothing can be wasted, right? So we can't sort of go to sleep in the kitchen. So efficiency is good, but it's not our only objective. And boy, is this true everywhere else in our practice, right? Sometimes you want someone to do something in order to learn how to do it, even if that person is not the most efficient one. And sometimes, as practitioners, we're asked to do something, and our response is, oh, well, someone else should do that. I've never done it before. And I will say, good, then you get to learn, right? So sometimes, yes, efficiency. And, you know, sometimes you want to put people in positions where they know what they're doing. But sometimes we need to accept that assignment as a means of pushing the boat out a little bit. Then we get to watch the ego come up. What if I do this and I don't do it right? What if I do this and I fail in front of everybody? So efficiency is good. It's not the only objective in practice. Timing is important. Yes, we want to make efficient use of time in the kitchen, but we can't make the cereal so far ahead that it sits on the stove for an hour becoming paste, waiting for the bell to ring, right? Oh, I'll be efficient. This is easy. I'll get it done, and then I'll move on to something else. And then meanwhile, that food, that soup, if it's miso soup, you can't boil that soup for an hour, right? That can't sit there like that. We have to be thoughtful about how do the things work together? What's the connection between things? Sometimes you really have to be working on 3 dishes or 5 dishes at the same time. And that's not being inefficient. That's what this moment is calling for. That's what this circumstance is calling for. There has to be a balance between the efficiency for me to make me comfortable and taking care of the food and the people and the timing, right? And the larger picture. So that takes creativity. That takes responsiveness, that takes figuring things out in the broadest possible way. So again, we have to be alive in the kitchen. We have to recognize this total dynamic functioning. We're right in the middle of this thing. And that's not just the functioning in the kitchen, that's the functioning in between the kitchen and the zendo and the temple and the outside, and right, all of it. Otherwise, rather than bringing out the best in this food, or the best in your kitchen crew, or your Zendo friends, right? Something is going to be less than optimal. So maybe that food doesn't have a good flavor. Maybe the texture isn't right. Maybe we've wasted some ingredients. Maybe things don't happen at the right time. Oh my gosh, we're going to be late. We're not going to get it all done. Everyone will be waiting. Maybe it's done so early that the food gets cold. right? It's not a simple thing to manage all that and have it come out exactly at the right time with the right amount and the right stuff. So in addition to the workers and the ingredients and the utensils that are there in the kitchen with you, the people in the zendo are also in the kitchen with you. This is not disconnected, right? We have to remember why we're cooking and who are we cooking for and what is the point of that practice and how are these things completely interpenetrated. So I often say that cooking for sesshin, or I guess I would say Nyoho cooking in general, is not like cooking for the family reunion or the block party or something, where you might decide to cook twice what you think you need because you want to be generous and you don't want anyone to go hungry and you want to make sure there's plenty, so heck, we're going to make way more than we think we're ever going to use. You want to be a good host, right? You don't want to run out. So we don't have that luxury when we're cooking in a temple and taking cooking as a practice. You might say that's the easy way out. It would be easy to just say, I'm just going to make a bunch and then everyone will have enough, right? It doesn't require, that kind of approach doesn't require us to think carefully about exactly who we're feeding and how many we're feeding and what the circumstance is. One of the first temples I ever practiced in Japan, we at that time did not have electricity. So not only were there not lights, and we were, we were cooking over fires, lighting was by kerosene lamp, that also meant there was no refrigeration. Boy, was that a good lesson in don't make more than you need, because by the next morning, that okayu was not going to be any good. So you really had to be very, very thoughtful. How much are people going to eat? How many are we feeding? What are they doing? So that's a real opportunity to look broadly over the largest possible circumstance. Ending up with mountains of leftovers, not a good outcome in a temple. Maybe you can't store them. Maybe there's no one around to eat them. What are you going to do with them? And again, we've got this thing about donors gave that food. If we can't eat it fast enough and it spoils, there's something that doesn't feel good about that, right? That's not good practice. Or there's just so much of it, we're so tired of it by the end, we can't face it anymore, right? Not so helpful. So that means as we get started with the cooking, we need to know how many people there are in the house, in the temple complex, in whatever building, right? Including, in our case, people who may be out of the zendo, but still need to eat food. Maybe they're working someplace, maybe they're in the infirmary, right? Can't just count the zendo, you have to count everybody. Then I would say we have to consider whether or not this is a formal meal. Are we eating this using oryoki, or are we eating this like a buffet line, like a chow line, or an informal meal? Sometimes in my experience, people will eat less when they're eating a formal meal with oryoki. They're often so, especially with newer folks, they're so caught up in the mechanics. They don't take seconds. They don't take much. They want to make sure they can manage the 2 or 3 bites they've got in their bowls and get them in their mouths because they're so caught up still with the mechanics of oryoki. Maybe these are folks who are eating after a fairly heavy work period. They're going to be hungry, right? More so than if they've been sitting perhaps all day and haven't done a lot of heavy work. So one thing I've noticed over time, for instance, and I've really had to bear this in mind, when I was making eggs for people who would eat maybe 1, maybe 2 scrambled eggs at home will eat 4 during sesshin. I could never make enough eggs, and I don't think it was the eggs. I think it was that food was being served from a pot. You don't know how many eggs you're actually eating. You just fill the bowl, man, right? So I learned I don't care how many people I have in the zendo that I think are going to eat 1 or 2 eggs, make some percentage more. I would routinely run out. It was just something you learned. So I always made a lot more actually than you think. And in that same Dharma center, there was a work period and an informal tea time in the afternoon. So one of the other things I learned was tea food tended to be pretty substantial because folks were like digging in the yard. They were doing real work. They weren't just sweeping floors. So they'd come in for tea time after an hour and a half of work, and they were hungry. So the spread was enormous. It wasn't fancy stuff. It was fruit and cheese and crackers and cookies, but there was a bunch of it, and people just would fall on this tea food, right? Fill themselves up, and then dinner was, what, an hour or 2 later, and no one was hungry for dinner. So you learn, you don't make a ton of dinner if people have filled themselves up on tea time, right? So these are just the things you need to pay attention to, balance. If I had simply made a meal menu, a meal plan, and cooked all that food, there would have been a lot of leftover dinner. So you learn to consider. One of the things I also learned to consider was the weather, actually, because where I was cooking, we spent a lot of time outside. Buildings were not air conditioned. Weather had a pretty big effect. So on a really hot day, I could not serve enough fresh cold fruit. People would eat it like gangbusters. Why? Because it was hot and it was wet and it was, appealing. So I had to always kind of gauge what's going to be appealing today. This was not a day to make piping hot soup. No one was going to eat that. So cold food, and a lot of cold food. Cold protein, a lot of cold tofu, right? So what was people's comfort level? What did their bodies need? What were the circumstances about that? I could have made a meal plan 3 days ahead, but if I didn't know it was going to be 97 and humid that day, I might not serve what people needed. So you have to be able to pivot in that way. So I learned from that. Clinging to expectations, not a good plan. I really had to consider the individual changing circumstances of real human beings. This is another case where my fabrication wasn't going to work. What was actually in front of me? What were the circumstances that were actually in front of me? So my assumptions, my hopes, yeah, and also, right? Not the helpful thing in this moment. So there had to be the right things in the right amount, not too much, not too little. So our attitude in this cooking practice is, yes, we're using the intellect. We have to calculate. We have to plan. We have to think. And we're also using more than the intellect. We also have to relate to people kind of on a human level. How are people feeling today? How's the practice going? People here are still laughing. Here, one rohatsu, which is a week long, 7 days, right? And I was the tenzo. And about halfway through, I served, it was December, because it's rohatsu. Halfway through, I served veggie burgers. So it was like hamburgers and potato chips and cupcakes and carrot sticks, right? And it was sort of a summer in December kind of thing. And I did it because that's where people's morale starts to break down. If you're sitting facing a wall 14 periods a day for 7 days, it's amazing the connection between food and morale. That's where people's morale starts to break down. They get tired, they get discouraged. Man, I'm only half done. Feels like I've been doing this forever. So a little something with the meal that goes, I'm here for you, can bounce people back up a little bit. Now, the problem with that is people can get attached to it. They remember that experience for the next 3 days. So you have to be a little careful, right? So as a tenzo, you also have to be a bit of a psychologist. Not only a cook, you also have to think about how do people feel about their practice? Are they tired? Are they discouraged? Read the room, right? Serve something that will boost people up a little bit. So we need every kind of wisdom, every kind of compassion. This is not about locking ourselves in the kitchen and cranking out meals. This is very much about interconnectedness. So when it's our turn to go into the kitchen and prepare the meal, what's important there is not, do I have professional cooking skills? Can I make the fanciest thing around? Can I make the most exotic food that anybody's ever had? It's remembering that this everyday activity, like all of our everyday activities, is practice. So cooking is practice, and sweeping the floor is practice, and washing our clothes is practice, right? Cooking gives us that really immediate dharma gate, which is, I think, why it keeps getting talked about in Zen practice. Simple food is fine as long as we're clear and sincere, right? What we're turning out is important, but what's equally important is, are we clear and sincere about that? Are we seeing clearly? Are we applying ourselves? Do we have a useful attitude about our practice? Not only are we feeding Buddhas and enabling that practice, I think it's a real practice development opportunities for ourselves, right, as well. So as we think about Nyoho food over these 4 months, we have so many dharma gates. Cooking is just one. What would folks like to say about the practice of cooking, being in the kitchen, practicing with that whole universe of activity? Because cooking is something that's familiar to us. Can we see it kind of in an interesting new way? Let me start with the folks in the room. Anybody here want to say something about cooking food? Please.
I'd like to make one simple comment. Chips during Rohatsu was the most insidious thing you could have ever done.
Chips during the rohatsu was the most insidious thing I could ever do. Were you attached to them for days afterwards?
No, you just can't chew silently.
No, you can't.
Everybody's chewing all at the same time. It's a cacophony of chewing.
Yes. So potato chips are like pickles in that way, and that was always the challenge when you're in the training temple, and there's always, it's often pickles, and you're supposed to eat silently.
I will also say, every Rohatsu since then, I look forward to Wednesdays.
You look forward to Wednesday, because that's the hump day. And
Well, maybe, just hopefully.
maybe something is happening in the kitchen to push us over the top. Please.
So there's a formula about what kind of food in which bowls. Could you articulate that? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So I suspect we'll hear some of that again from Sawyer, but yes. So we've talked about Taishiki Ryo, right? We've talked about the amount and the color and the materials. So there needs to be balance across the meal for colors. We try to get all the colors in. And when it comes to an oryoki meal, typically it's starch in the first bowl, protein of some kind in the second bowl, and the third bowl is probably salad, veg, something like that. So I mean, it's a very rough guideline. So in that first bowl, it could be rice, it could be cereal. Here in North America, sometimes it's a piece of toast, or it's a biscuit, right? Because there's some kind of grain in that first bowl. And the second bowl might be tofu or eggs or tempeh or something. And the third bowl, again, salad, something steamed, something like that. Is that the breakdown that you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's because that's typical for oryoki. We've tended to kind of keep that same structure for less formal meals, simply because it gives us a balance, right? It's a really helpful trellis. It's a really helpful place to start, so that everything, so we get some balance in nutrition, but also in texture and in color and other things like that. So we also try to make sure that we're not cooking everything the same way. It'd be good not to have 3 boiled things. So maybe something is steamed, something is, I don't know, braised, something is raw. It's all about balance and variety. So interestingly, when I first heard that thing about the colors, we need to have all 5 colors and 6 tastes in the meal, I thought, oh, that's something new and exotic and interesting. And of course, come to find out, like, our grandmothers have been saying that for years, as long as you balance the colors, you've probably got some balanced nutrition. So the whole point of that is not necessarily shoehorn every possible variant into that meal, but simply to take the approach that says things should be balanced. There should be a variety, color, flavor, texture, cooking method, all that stuff. And if we go starch, protein, veg, we at least know we've got some nutritional balance there, right? Is that enough about that? Other things you'd like to say or ask?
So what would normally go into the Buddha bowl?
Rice, grain, pilaf, cereal, some kind of, grain, something like that. Sometimes, it can be pasta, but you have to be careful because you can only use a spoon in that first bowl, so it better not be spaghetti. Right? It better be something you can eat with a spoon. The other two, it's hashi, so you can pick things up. But then again, you see, the tenzo has to be thoughtful, because how are we serving that meal and how are we eating that meal? So at some point, I hope I have the chance to talk about serving and eating, but the tenzo really has to think ahead to say, this is a lovely lasagna, but stringy cheese, man. How is that going to go into somebody's oryoki bowl, I mean, you really have to be thoughtful. I remember years ago, a teacher saying, now, your tenzos, you got to be careful, because if you're really doing this form properly and you're not using the spoon in the second bowl, what happens to the lentils? Can you really eat lentils with ohashi? So yeah, we have to be thoughtful about that. Did I cut you off? Were you going to say something else?
No, that you got it.
Okay. Other things in this room? Oh, look at the hands. Sawyer and then Doji.
So first of all, I really am enjoying that and find it helpful to think of, even alone in that little kitchen, there's many beings involved.
Yep, there's an altar in there for a reason.
Right, and to sort of take that approach with all of these so-called tools that are sort of objects to an outcome, to see them as, see that you're no different from them in a certain way. You and the tools are functioning in a very complex way, but sort of as one entity in somehow.
Yeah.
And just bringing that perspective, I think, is helpful to avoid getting stuck in stress about the mechanics of everything, because it is a complex process going on and you have to manage stuff. But something like that helps me remember this is related to zazen directly. Like this is not something that I'm doing in order to enable other people to do zazen,
Mm-hmm.
but the same kind of functioning is continuous. But of course, like what I've kind of struggled with more than once cooking during sesshin is that it just can feel so different to be the one in there managing
Mm-hmm.
and doing all of that distinguishing and calculating and then when you are just facing the wall, it's like in a sense there really is a difference between what you're doing.
Of course.
And yet we have to somehow say this is still zazen.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I haven't quite resolved that. And I don't know if that's ever resolved.
Well, I just think that's one of the dharma gates, right? That practice allows us to do, because I mean, I remember, I'm sure this happened to everybody here. You know, I remember years and years ago when I first was starting to practice and I was first starting to do sesshin, and then along comes an assignment that says you're the kitchen assistant, and you think, oh, I'm here to sit zazen. I'm not here to do that kitchen stuff, right? And you think, well, there's a break in my zazen. I'm going to get up and leave the zendo and do something else, which is separate from what I was doing in the zendo, and then somehow I have to get back to my cushion and get back in that place. And of course, after a while, you realize, no, wait a minute, you never actually leave the zendo. You go into the kitchen, but you don't actually leave the zendo. So how can we keep that same approach? And having to go back and forth like that is an interesting way. I'm going to say figure it out, but we don't figure it out that way. So coming in and out of a sesshin container by actually leaving the temple is harder. Coming in and out. This is at least, we step away from the cushion, and how do we recognize we're still doing zazen with all these people? After a while, there's something similar about the approach. You drop into a similar place, right? There's something about there's something about the attention, which is you can sort of carry over, right? But this is one of the reasons that's such an opportunity. If your assignment is go into the kitchen, and make the dinner, it's not an interruption to your zazen, and it's not stealing time from I always felt like, this is stealing time from my sesshin, No, that's not actually what's going on. So it's a real opportunity, but it's not so easy as you say. And I think that's one of the reasons why the tenzo is such technically a high-ranking job, because you've got to be able to take your zazen off the cushion and go in there and manage food and ingredients and people and tools, and produce a meal which meets criteria, meets certain criteria, right? And then go back and drop into your cushion. Not so easy.
Yeah, because of course, I mean, you could just hire a very skilled cook
Yeah.
to just do it, and there may not be any relation to zazen.
No, and you really feel it when that happens, because folks here might remember for a while we were catering those meals because we seriously did not have the human labor. We couldn't have done sesshin, and it felt very different. There was something missing. The meals were fine, they met criteria. We were doing informal meals, of course. Caterer would come and bring the food and set it all up, and it was lovely, but there was something about that which didn't feel like practice. So was that useful even to do that? Because it just felt like there was such a gap. I don't know. Good news is we're not doing that anymore. We have enough leadership and enough participation to do that. But yeah, that was an interesting time. Yeah. Please.
Your story about Zuiko and the spoon on it just reminded me that, I think one of the hardest reverse culture shock things coming back to the US after being in Japan, and I think that's like one of the most unique things maybe about Japanese culture, is the degree to which people try not to bother other people compared to anywhere else I've been. And it's really irritating coming back here, because people don't care at all if they're bothering you in the US, pretty much. But I think it's such a nice practice, and at the temple, it was something that, even though it's just a general part of Japanese culture, it still is, an expression, I think, of interconnectedness and understanding that it's not just about you and what you want to do, but about other people's kind of personal space and sort of right to peace. And it was something that the Japanese priests really had to emphasize with us, with the foreigners, because coming in, we were all just behaving the way that we normally would, which to them is like very annoying. So I like that story. But then also, Todo-san would always say before sesshin.
I was just gonna say,
that,
I went there too.
yeah, you shouldn't bother anyone else, but also don't be
Don't
bothered.
distract others and don't be distracted by others.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think I'm like Suiko, like I'm maybe okay at not bothering others, but I have a hard time not being bothered. So it's something to work on.
So when we step on you or annoy you, you're gonna send up a flare. Remember that story? Well, I just think that's one of the reasons that residential practice is so important, right? Because you're cheek by jowl with these people. You don't get to choose who you live with. You don't get to choose who you room with. And somehow you've got to get along. And it's a very direct exercise in, I have to let this person not make me crazy. And also, I mean, people are not that far away from each other, right? We have to sort of pay attention to what are we doing and the effect we're having on other people. And, I live alone, so my cats don't care. If I'm up at 2 a.m, bumbling around, my cats don't care. There's something useful, I think, for Westerners about being in that container. I see people go and do that over the years. I see people go do their training, they come back and something shifts, right? There's something different about broader awareness, or I'm not sure. It's really interesting. It takes immersion. You can't go do it for a week. A week of sesshin is great, but that won't teach you that, right? That won't give you the experience that you had with that. And also, it's just helpful, as you say, if teachers are reminding us all the time. Do you see what you're doing here? Right? Did you notice what happened when you did that? Because we don't always notice. So I just think that kind of training is so helpful for so many reasons.
Well, Ram Dass would teach that if somebody's irritating you, it's your opportunity to see where you're still stuck.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and also it's your opportunity perhaps to have the hard conversation. It's wisdom and compassion, right? Sometimes it's our opportunity to say, I love you, but if you leave your socks on the floor one more time, man. So, there is a thing about accepting what people are doing. And then I think there's also a skillful action piece that says sometimes for the good of everybody, we need to have the hard conversation, and that takes some courage. That also is part of interconnectedness and living in community. So one of the things we say about sesshin is it's a really intensive opportunity to study what community is. And it's not always fun. So anyway, I could tell stories about that, but I won't. Other things in this room. Folks at home, anything you'd like to say or ask? Ado, good to see you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I was just thinking about my tenzo experience and the difference between being a tenzo at a local temple or being a tenzo like living in Minneapolis and going down to Hokioji and having to get all the food ahead or there. And the third situation was at Romanji, which is, there's at least one person living there all the time, and they have a garden, and so they have a lot of food actually in canned and in the freezer. And often people would come with their meal plan and want to go immediately to the grocery store to get everything for their meal plan. And Shokan would be very frustrated because there was a lot of food there. And the challenge was you had to basically take an inventory of that food and start planning from there, not the other end, like what I want to make. You have to plan with what is there. And then if you must, you might be able to go get some groceries once a week, but as little as possible. I mean, we were supposed to encourage to use what was there and try not to add to that any more than necessary because there's food there. But that is a really, really big challenge for a tenzo.
Well, it is, and I think it's a harder challenge when that's not your residence all the time, right? Because the easiest thing to do is make your plan and buy your groceries on the way down there, and then you get there and there's everything you need and there's no problem. But if you don't live there, you don't know what's there.
Right, so you have to show up and take inventory because you have no idea what to expect.
Right, right. Well, you may remember all those years ago, in Minneapolis, where there were often 2 and 3 and 4 open packages of something in the kitchen. Because even though we were in and out, even though that was our place of practice, 6 days a week, nobody ever looked in the cupboards. They just bought everything and then showed up and opened a new package. And then I'd go in there and go through the food and there'd be 3 open packages of something and you're just like, right? So there is this larger piece about interconnectedness and paying attention, which I think in some ways is even harder if you're a guest tenzo, right? There's a whole other layer of attention that needs to go with that. So yeah, I remember those days.
That reminds me of another circumstance at MDMC, the local center. So one of the things you'd have to do in preparation is go in at least a day before and go through the cupboards and go through the refrigerator, because unfortunately the refrigerator might be full of leftovers from some other event.
Yep, and no one was living there, so that was a case where you really couldn't overproduce because there was nowhere for that to go.
Right.
Absolutely. I see another hand up, and so you're going to have to tell me who that is.
There's Abby.
Abby! Okay, let's hear from Abby.
Yes, most of your references are to meals served during session, but I just want to say, as a layperson and a cook for myself and another person, and all of these things are so applicable and
Of course.
so helpful. So thank you.
Oh, not at all. So I hope people were extrapolating and saying, yes, this also applies to my family or my friends or whoever I'm cooking for, or even just for me. As I was writing that talk, I thought this is really interesting because I live alone. So I go into my kitchen and I make food for me. Can I apply sort of what I'm going to tell people in a group to me going and doing whatever I want, eating whatever I, happen to have or whatever I feel like making all the noise I want because I'm the only one, right? It's really interesting to take that same approach and go, it's just me in my kitchen and still I'm in there with all these beings, right? There's a practice that needs to happen. So I'm glad you kind of made the connection. I didn't make it overtly and I'm glad you did, because nothing I'm talking about here does not apply to, right? To cooking at home, even, the bowl of cereal in the morning. Same lessons apply.
You eat with your cats.
I do eat with my cats. Unfortunately, we don't eat the same thing because, man, their food is disgusting. Okay. Other things from folks at home. All right. Anything anywhere remaining? All right. Let's do our closing chant. Thanks, everybody.